big question. So, well, I will focus more on the genetic side of depression. So you have many different causes for depression: epigenetics, genetics, biology. But I will really focus on genetics for the simple reason I'm geneticist, so I'm kind of comfortable with that topic. So I'm a French scientist, so please do not vote for the accent because I'm definitely beaten. I moved to McMaster. Well, first thing, I have no potential financial conflict of interest. I stole your slide actually, so sorry about that. I just moved from France to Canada a little bit more than 3 years ago. And it took me some adaptation because you have kind of change of scale between the two countries for certain aspects. But I adapted very, very quickly to this country because we have so much in common. So, well, and my field of expertise is more genetics of obesity and genetics of type 2 diabetes. So I started with more simple disease, diabetes. Probably the pathophysiology is a little bit simpler than emotional disease or mood disorders. But Zena proposed me to collaborate on this topic of genetics of depression, and she probably had very good arguments because we work together now. And the other thing is that there are some links, as Zena mentioned, between metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes. It seems that you have some shared molecular determinants between the different diseases eventually. Okay, so what is depression? Depression is a multifactorial disorder. It's really the perfect illustration. So you have the impact of genes. That's the theoretical model, and the impact of environment, and genes and environments interact together and lead to depression. So obviously I took the illustration of the finger. Wow, it was perfect. No noise. Yeah, I'm so bad. Huh? So I took the sculpture of Rodin because he's French, obviously. And when I was kid, I visited. Well, I saw that and I said, well, he looks so sad, this guy. So I took this picture. So he is kind of depressed. I don't know what is your feeling about that. So there is interaction between genes and environment. So first, let's talk about environments, risk environments, and I won't talk about every risk factor because there are many. But childhood maltreatment seems to be really associated with an increase in the risk of depression. Stressful life events. So if you experience the death of a relative, if you divorce, if you end a relationship, it can increase the risk of depression. If you have a pre-existent disease, so cardiovascular disease, especially stroke, Parkinson's disease, obesity, is kind of a risk factor for the development of depression. Age is important. It seems that you have waves of depression. I think during the 30s, is that right? Excuse me?
Mid-20s, 40s, and then about 65.
Exact, and a second wave or older. And having a baby, can be considered as a really a great joy, but you have the postpartum depression, and some women develop very severe forms of depression after having a baby, so it can be a risk factor. gender, we told about that, and ethnicity as well. And it's a complex, well, debate about ethnicity, because depending on your ethnic background, depression can be more or less a taboo. So in certain countries, when you do studies, there is no depression. In reality, you know, there are some people with depression, but they hide that. So it's very complex. So, and obviously well, as scientists, we discover this risk factor having some epidemiological approach, so observational data, longitudinal cohorts. So we follow people living in a certain or specific environment, and we can observe that in certain risk environment, people are more likely to develop depression. Okay, so, so I told about not sex but gender as an environment, because it's all associated with, you know, gender, societal differences and stuff like that. But if my memory is good, I think we don't have the same chromosome. So I have a X and Y, you have two X chromosomes. So sex is also like part of genetic factors. And and obviously, if you are a woman, you are twice more likely to develop depression, as we discussed before. So there is something with gender or sex or both. We don't really know. Ethnicity is important, so it seems that it can play a role. And again, it can be genes, it can be lifestyle associated with a certain geographical area or with a certain culture. And specific genetic factors, and we will focus more on that tonight. So, first question, is depression an inherited disorder? We talk about genes, but you need to prove that. So how can you prove that a disorder, disease, has some kind of inherited component? Well, I think the fact that women are more at risk, well, it can be obviously environment, it can be lifestyle, it can be gender differences, but it can eventually be also genetic differences. We never know. So, in the genetic, and you have some sex-specific genetic effects. So, having only one X chromosome, for instance, if there is a mutation on your X chromosome, as a man, you cannot compensate because you have only one copy. As a woman, you have the second copy, so it can balance things. So what about the Y chromosome? Do we have special things on that? I don't know. But eventually, there are some genes related to depression that protect against depression. I don't know. So it lets the question open, but at least this gender difference is kind of indirect argument in favor of an inherited component. So ethnic difference is, it can be lifestyle, culture, but it can also be specific, ethnic-specific genetic variants, because we know that we have like some kind of genetic variations. You have, for instance, what we term funding effect. So some mutations are really specific to only one population in the world, and it may explain why, for instance, people of European ancestry or Caucasians have twice a risk to develop depression in comparison with African ancestry or Latino American ancestry. Latino American ancestry is in reality a mix of different ethnic backgrounds, so European ancestry, native South American ancestry. So it's a mix, and we can see that well, depending on the ethnic background, you can have differences. But again, you cannot really, well, you cannot conclude 100% it's gene. It can be genes, it can be something else. And after that, we have a familial component for depression. So how do we measure that? We take one proband, so someone with the disease, the disorder, and we investigate in the pedigree. So do you have some first degree relatives with the same disease or not? So first degree relative means that you have 50% of genes in common. So, for instance, brother and sister have 50% of genes in common. It's maybe a bad news for you, but you share 50% of your genome with your brother or your sister, and even worse, 50% of genes are shared with your parents. It's terrible. And if the disease is not genetic, well, either you are within a pedigree or between pedigrees, you have exactly the same risk to develop the disease. But it seems that for depression, if you have one brother, one sister, one parent having depression, you have 2 to 3 times more risk to develop depression yourself. So it tells you that probably there is something genetic. But again, it's not the final proof, because it can be genes or shared environment. Because as a family, you live in more homogeneous conditions. So maybe the fact that you are more likely to develop the disease is because you share one specific environment that other people do not share. So it's not the perfect proof. Hopefully, we have twin studies. So comparing, homozygous twins, or how do we say that, identical twins, or fraternal twins, so just brother, sister, or 50% genes common, but they are twins, or real twins, so 100% genes in common. You can see that when they look exactly the same, they have 100% of genes in common. Sometimes they are brother, sisters, or things like that. So when we compare the risk of depression in fraternal twins or identical twins, if there is a higher similarity between the identical twins, it means that genes are involved because they are more genetically homogeneous. And actually, working with twins, researchers have determined that about 37% of depression risk is determined by genetic factors, which is not so much, I would be tempted to say. For instance, for obesity, it's more closer to 50-70%. So there is some modest genetic component in the trait, but it's not huge. Like, for instance, height, so it's 90% of genes. So if your parents are tall, you will be tall. There is no way. Yeah, you cannot avoid. Surprisingly, maybe I was surprised by that, the shared environment, so what you experience as a family doesn't play a big role in the development of depression. So it's interesting. But the non-shared environment, so more what you experience as an individual, your specific experience of life, and individual experience of life has some impact. So it's 63%. So we may conclude that, depression is mainly an environmental disease. It's maybe, but if you have genetic susceptibility, you are more vulnerable in a specific subset or in a specific environmental exposure. So it's worse to find the genes contributing to depression as a result. It's worse, but it's difficult. Okay, so now I will tell you a little bit about gene phishing. Okay, so first thing, well, when I was taught genetic at this time, long time ago, well, mainly it was Mendelian traits. So you all remember about that. So mutation, disease, or with the Mendel P's, mutation, phenotype, no mutation, no phenotype. So that's a simple way to see genetics. But we can ask the question, is it possible that just one mutation makes you very susceptible to depression? Do we have some families and depression co-segregate in each generation as a Mendelian trait? So people with mutation in the family have the disease and people without the mutation don't have the disease. So did we observe that? Do we observe that? It seems that, and we, well, someone mentioned the adaptative scenario before, so I read a little bit about that. So, well, so I think the idea is that because people need more attention, they are kind of favored. I would say that it's kind of mixed because, well, renewed geneticists in the depression field think that it's very unlikely to have these Mendelian forms of depression with one mutation increasing strongly the risk of depression because depression is associated with a reproductive disadvantage. So, well, for different reasons, but the reproductive success of people with depression is lower. So as a result, well, if you consider that people have less children, natural selection may counter-select this highly prevalent form of depression running in families. So, well, we don't expect to see so much of these mutations with huge impact. However, well, so I tried to find something in literature. There is only one, only one study, or I did wrong, but there is at least one study showing that some genetic defects are really specific to depression cases. So, well, so Glessner and colleagues, they checked the whole genome and they studied structural variants, so deletion, duplication, kind of part of your chromosome are deleted or added in excess, things like that. So it's not a mutation, it's just a portion of your chromosome which is kind of deleted or duplicated. And they found, well, they found in a specific area of chromosome 5q, duplication only found in five decreased cases out of about 1,006 and 700. And they checked this duplication because they only found, well, less than 1% of depressive cases had this duplication. But the striking observation is that they checked if this duplication was present in 35,000 control people. And they didn't find the duplication. So, well, it seems that this duplication may have a huge impact on depression risk because we don't find this duplication in non-depressed cases. And more interesting, maybe the gene, one of the gene duplicated, SLIT3, is involved in axonal guidance. So, well, you know, axon, what is it? It makes the bridge between different neurons. So it makes some sense biologically speaking. I need to fast up. Okay, so that's for the Mendelian, well, depression as a Mendelian disorder. It doesn't seem to be really the more important thing in depression genetics. So now I think the more, well, likely model is more a polygenic model. So in this model, you don't have only one gene and you have the disease, but you have a number of genetic variants frequent in general populations, and they increase slightly your risk of depression, let's say 5%, 10%, 15%. And well, people with a high genetic risk to develop depression are people who accumulate a big number of these variants with small effects. So that's the polygenic model of depression. So does it work if we make this hypothesis? So one very, well, so you can see my joy to make experiments. Huh? You see that on my face. It's striking. I like that a lot. So, well, I have in my hand like some kind of DNA arrays, and it's very powerful because you have up to 4 million genetic markers on one array. So in one experiment, I used to do that. Actually, I was doing that because I was leaving later than the technicians. So they were giving me arrays to fast up the experiments. So I was the last one to put an array in the machine. And it's very simple. You put the array in the machine and that's all. And you have like huge amount of information. All the common variation, all the frequent polymorphism are covered. It's crazy. So we were exposed to this discovery, I would say 7 years ago, and it's really a way to uncover the genome. So people use that. So we use that for obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. We found more than 1,000 genes involved in complex traits. It works pretty well. But the thing is that for depression, it didn't work. So and you know, so you can say, well, maybe the study there was not enough people, but you look at that, close to 10,000 cases, 10,000 controls, they uncover the genome, a lot of money, and they replicated that. The best signals in close to 7,000 additional depression cases and 50,000 controls, and they found nothing. So it's pretty disappointing. Yeah. So, well, so the genetic dissection of depression was not like so big. It was not a Canadian fish. Huh? Okay, so, well, why is it so difficult to find genes associated with depression quickly? So it's first thing, the diagnosis, Zeno mentioned how difficult it is to diagnose depression. So even if we have tools, not everyone uses the high gold standard tools, DSM-5, for depression. So in genetic studies sometimes, just like depression symptoms or not recurrent depression, so it's not necessarily homogeneous. Depression is an heterogeneous disorder. You can become depressed because you have a baby, because you have a huge stress at work, like me. Because it's seasonal depression, so it's only and what the people do right now, they put together everyone and say, oh, we find nothing. But I think that the genetic architecture of postpartum depression is probably very different from the genetic architecture of stress-induced depression, because during pregnancy, you have the hormone balance is completely different and things like that. So probably it's more homogeneous. So the postpartum depression as a genetic trait, and we need to work probably on subcategories. Probably bigger sample, are important. And you can have gene-environment interaction. So there was a paper showing that for a serotonin transporter genetic variant, there was an effect on depression only if people were experiencing adverse event during childhood. So probably some environmental exposure are kind of pushing people to develop the disease if they have some genetic vulnerability. Well, at this stage, we didn't explore all the genetic variants, so structural variants, rare genetic variants, we need to do some whole genome, whole exome sequencing to progress in that area. And the other thing is that we can have original hypothesis. And that's what we did with my colleague Zina. We made the hypothesis because there is a link between obesity and depression. And so, well, we say, well, if there are some link between obesity, depression, maybe you have some genes shared. And we check the association of the main contributor to obesity. And we thought that this gene would be associated with higher risk of depression because that's the way it is in epidemiological studies. But actually, this gene is protective against depression. So it was totally unexpected, and we were so, well, unfaithful that, well, you say that, or we were so skeptical that we checked that in 3 additional cohorts, and it seems that globally it works. So sometimes we can find, well, genes contributing to depression having some kind of different approach. Think different, think Pepsi. Okay, any questions? The French courtesy.